Actually, I'm not gonna do the comment just yet. I gotta make an intervention, an intercession, and I gotta talk about my guy Paul. You guys know who Paul Warburg is? Anybody ever heard? Anybody? You know who Paul Warburg is? You know who Paul Warburg is? I did this thing. There's another video I got somewhere. Have I ever posted it? I don't think I have. It's just I make a lot of videos because I got no one to talk to, and I'm so rich. I'm making these electronic deposits of my own wealth. One day, I'm actually gonna bust them, and when I bust them, you're gonna realize how rich we were. Anyway, I got this thing with Paul Warburg. See, I was on the street, and one day I walk into the library and I find this book, and it's attracting me. I get attracted to old books. It's this thing I got. They like me, I like them, and I pick up this book, and it's about history of the Federal Reserve. 2 book series, big books. They're like this big, man. Together, like put them on the shelf. They're like this big. It's like as big as my head, and they're on the shelf. And I pull them off the shelf, and and I'm like, well, I've heard of Warburg. I don't know what Warburg really is. I open the book, and it gets me right exactly what I needed. I was stunned. Whatever you might think you might know. He was talking specifically about the difference between the banking system in the United States and the banking system in Europe. And one of the things he says is that the banking houses of Europe had this situation regarding credit that had a sort of a letter of credit sort of thing. And you always needed more than one person for one thing. You always needed more than one name as the backing. But that these letters of credit would kind of open up a period of time when things were available under that particular line, and then at some point it would close off and move on. But that it circulated in a way that allowed for less volatility because it was more confined. There were more specific kinds of parameters around qualification, around standards that needed to be met in order to maintain it. And it was intended to be kind of self regulating in terms of what was accessible and what was not accessible. The concept of bonds had a very, very different meaning in the European system than it did in the United States. And that in the United States, more than focusing on that kind of a system, what the United States did was focus a lot on stocks and shares of stocks and issuances of stocks and sales and trades of shares of stock. And this was intentionally done in a manner to create a form of high risk speculation. And that he says in this history, he says something almost prophetic, where he says that the imbalances between the American system and the European system portend a situation of serious concern, a kind of calamity from which we will not recover. And he says this as a Whig. And my understanding is when he wrote this history, it was after the approval of the Federal Reserve Bank. There was a lot going on. If you read for the primary source documents, which I've had access to, some of them, the actual history when it was first proposed, what happened after it was first proposed, which is a very big controversy. At some point I'm gonna find out about that, and then this understanding that when he first started off, he had this plan and he showed it to some people he was told to show it to, and they said, oh, no, we're not going to do anything about this right now. No, nobody will support this. And then so he went to doing what he was doing, and they came back to him and they're like, oh, look, where's that plan? Let's do it now. And he's like, you can't do it now. The conditions aren't right. It's not going to work now. And then after that, right? Lots of years after that, they're starting the Federal Reserve Bank, right? There's a whole story there. But by the time it gets to him, actually writing the official history of the Federal Reserve Bank, he is almost like sounding a very significant call of alarm. That this system the United States has that's so heavily devoted to stock issuances and trading in stocks is unsustainable for a long term. And he makes a point of, really bringing into bear the concept that even in the 1930s, the United States was a young country. And it was dealing with a global financial context of places that had long histories. We're talking hundreds of years more than the United States. And so figuring out how to try to navigate what the United States needed for international commerce while also addressing the fact that the stock system the United States made was not for people in the United States. And that's where then you got to go from Paul Warburg to some of the actual founders. And when you start looking at things like what Dr. Benjamin Rush said, and his correspondences with Thomas Jefferson, I know that there's this focus on these founding fathers that were slave owners. Well, there was a lot of controversy going on at that time, and a lot of reprisal going on in house in order to try to compel people to cede to the policies of slavery. And I just think it's very important from a reasonable, rational perspective to bring this up. Prior to the Continental Congress, Thomas Jefferson excoriated the King of England and said, "Stop sending slaves to America. Stop cutting deals with people that are involved with the African slave trade to try to compel the United States or the Americas to import slaves. We don't want it. It's against our concept of who we are. It is against who we are." He also talks about what it meant to be a Saxon and the history of the Saxons and how the Saxons were a group of people that came into a political decision to assert autonomy from the totality of the monarchical rule, and how that specific decision was in contradiction of the serfdom policies that were ongoing. And so his understanding of who he was and who America was stop slavery and understand that we've always come from a place where we let you know who we are, and we don't accept that our fellow country people are supposed to be in bondage to us. He wrote this letter. I'm paraphrasing it. He says it very concisely. He does this thing they do where they have this, "You're a royal excellent," all these salutations. I mean, it was absolutely adamant. And I believe that what happened is that he, along with certain other people, especially by virtue of certain state jurisdictions within which they were leaned on. They were told, well, if you want to actually get the American project, if you want your independence from the King of England, then you have to agree to stand with us and accept slavery. We need it. If we're going to be able to get blah, blah, they came up with whatever fucking excuse they could. And he ended up giving in. You got to understand, that's what you're tearing down, right? You're tearing down people that will cede on matters of principle for political opportunism, right? You're tearing down monuments to people that gave in to lesser evilism, right? You're tearing down monuments of people that agreed to give a categorization to one group of people that had priority just by virtue of a particular classification, and then coordinate that with the kinds of paperwork that were allowed to be traded and brokered on their lives to define their social positioning and their economic value in the supply chain, right? That's what you're tearing down, right?